Welcome back. June 28th, 2021. If there's confusion in the air about critical race theory, what I gather will be the phrase of the year. Confusion about what it means, confusion over whether it's being taught or not, confusion about whether it should be taught. If there's confusion about all of this, I don't blame the confused. Not even those on the purported right quite get it all the time. Some get it exactly backwards, including among self-described conservatives. Parenthetical, this makes me want to just take a moment to say, as we are getting into primary season here, you're going to see the word conservative thrown around a lot, especially by Republican candidates. My advice, do not take their word for it. Start with the rule that if someone has to tell you who they are, you obviously start by not knowing who they are. If someone has to tell you something you wonder about, it's not obvious that they are that. By their fruit shall you know them. What is it they have done? Where were they in the fight when there was a fight and things mattered? Have they done unpopular things with the media to support a conservative cause, idea, or agenda? Or have they kept their head down until opportunity strikes for their own agendas and careers, long after all the fights and work are over? I suppose that was the first thing that offended me thinking about this when Mitt Romney, for example, said he was extremely conservative. First, that's something no conservative ever said about themselves. Second, why would one need to put a superlative on their own description when they've been in public life on the national stage for a decade? Third, why would someone need to reassure a conservative voter or votary if they were conservative, had they spoken and acted as such, had not given cause for doubt? Which brings me to my fourth point from the movie Ronin. If there's doubt, there's no doubt. This is the corollary to the John O'Sullivan rule. Any organization or enterprise that is not expressly right-wing will become left-wing over time. This is all true of people who say they're conservatives but show no evidence of it as well. Why is it? This is not a departure from what I was saying earlier, because it goes for Republican officials as well as institutions. All the more reason, of course, to be wary the liberal wolf in Republican garb. Why the preordained drift portside all the time, everywhere, and never starboard? As one analyst pointed out, one of the reasons for this is leftist intolerance versus right-wing intolerance. Right-wingers are willing to hire openly left-wing employees in the interest of fairness. Left-wingers, utterly intolerant, will not allow a non-liberal near them and will harass them at every opportunity. The result over time is that conservative enterprises are infiltrated by leftists, but leftist enterprises remain the same or get worse. Also, leftism is in and of itself a form of decay. It's what happens not just to television shows, but to nations, churches, and universities as the energy given off by the big bang of their inception slowly ebbs away. Rather than expend vitality and originality in creation, they become obsessed with introspection, popularity, and lethargy. Leftism is entropy of the spirit and intellect. Anyhow, as I was saying, beware the self-described conservative who has not given you evidence of conservatism in their past. What have they said or done that is conservative? I gave you my test above. By their fruit shall you know them. What is it they've done? Where were they in the fight when there was a fight? Have they done unpopular things to support a conservative cause, idea, or agenda that has upset the media? Or have they kept their head down until opportunity strikes for their own agendas and careers? That's my test. This brings us to confusion caused by a self-described conservative when it comes to critical race theory. I speak of Ross Douthat's op-ed this morning in the New York Times. He writes in the New York Times today, you have progressives who until recently, breathing the sweet air of revolution, suddenly denied they are interested in anything radical at all. In particular, after conservatives began using critical race theory as an umbrella term for educational strategies they oppose, progressives began insisting that CRT is either academic and irrelevant, just high-level grad school stuff, or anodyne and uncontroversial, just a way of saying we should teach kids about slavery and racism. That's close and fair enough, but then he writes this, quote, "Progressives want to change the way schools teach American history. They want to finally exorcise the ghost of lost cause historiography, the romanticization of the Confederacy that still haunts textbooks in some corners of the South. Then they want to broaden the narrative of race beyond the Civil War and the Civil Rights era, recovering stories of African American resistance under slavery and the history of racial subjugation from the 1870s onward, giving events like the Tulsa Massacre a special prominence." That's close and fair enough in its part about changing education, in its part about wanting to finally exorcise the ghost of lost cause historiography and the romanticization of the Confederacy. It's utter fantasy. While no doubt some precincts in the South, as everywhere, have a few kooky textbooks available for adoption, I have no proof the pro-Confederacy books have ever been anywhere adopted or even taken or read that seriously. For the real truth is progressives want to change schools and pedagogy all over the country. Most of the critical race theory controversy has not been in places like South Carolina, but rather progressive and Tony suburban areas in Virginia, California, and New York, with public and high-priced private schools alike. But not even that is the major fantasy in Ross's statement. The major point, which he should be smart enough to understand, is that critical race theory agenda and understanding of history is the Southern history of the United States as promoted and argued by the lost cause, the Confederacy. I don't know how many times I can point this revolutionary irony out, but the side in the Civil War that thought our founding a lie and that all men were not intended to be treated equal by our founders was the losing side, the South, the Confederacy, as it is BLM and Antifa and the left today. They share the same view of our founding, and that should be the most instructive thing around. The side opposed to that view and that thought our founding was dedicated to true liberty and equality for all men was the Union. The side we are on still as conservatives today. Today's left sounds like Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis when speaking about the founding. Today's right, as always, at least since 1856, speaks highly of the founding and sounds like Ulysses S. Grant, Martin Luther King, and Frederick Douglass, at least in argument and position. If there's a lost cause, historiography, and romanticism in this country, philosophically, ideologically, historically, in other words, in every way that matters, if there's a lost cause, historiography there, it's on the progressive left, CRT side. Ross ought to have known better about that. Thus, confusion. Added confusion. When all we seek is clarity, which is so much simpler. What we've done with CRT and the study and argument about race in America is take the obvious and rational and obscure it by means sophistic and demagogic. However, Ross continued on to write, quote, "In its contest with the new progressivism, the right is abandoning Lee and rallying to Lincoln for its own nationalist political purpose, but in a way that accepts a different center for historical debate than existed even when I was in high school," close quote. Ross is probably about 45. Buy me a vowel because OMG in the parlance of our times, or is that already a decade old? I'm not sure. But since when did the right embrace Lee and Davis? If they did it wrongly. As the historian Al Felsenberg put it, it's a mystery quite how the party of Abraham Lincoln, born in the moral outrage of the great Northern abolitionists, could become in the minds of some the party of Davis or Lee. To some, Davis's and Lee's legacy may seem one of support for states' rights. To others, however, they remain Southern slaveholders, Democrats, presidents, and vice presidents of a confederacy born in rebellion and secession in defense of the moral good of slavery. Or perhaps it's not such a mystery. From their 1854 beginning, the Republicans were the party that fought slavery, opposed Reconstruction, and opposed segregation, while the Democrats were the party of Jim Crow, race baiting, and Dixiecrats. But for many years, progressive historians have been telling a story of America's steady march to liberalism, in which all good comes from Democrat and all evil from Republican. And not only have Democrats learned this false lesson and claimed an undeserved reputation on race, but even Republicans, too many of them, have absorbed their enemy's lesson until at last they find themselves claiming people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Alexander Stephens as one of their own. In order to construct their progressive story, left-leaning historians were forced to pass over innumerable Democratic sins in their textbooks. Andrew Jackson's treatment of Native Americans, Southern populists' racial demonizing, Woodrow Wilson's segregationism, William Jennings Bryan's support for the KKK, and Franklin Roosevelt's indifference to anti-lynching legislation. Might add, never mind anti-Semitism. Simultaneously, they were compelled to ignore the efforts the conservative made to improve race relations. New York boss Roscoe Conkling escorted Mississippi's Hiram Revels, the first black senator, down the aisle to his swearing-in when no one else would. But his courage has found few admirers among reform-minded historians. In the 1880s, as a young congressman, Henry Cabot Lodge introduced a voting rights bill, but he's known to history primarily as Woodrow Wilson's antagonist in international relations. Uncle Joe Canham, the tyrannical Speaker of the House in the early 1900s, according to history, backed every civil rights measure introduced during his long tenure. But he's more famous in the textbooks for being a tyrannical speaker and for supporting tariffs and trusts. Presidents Grant, Harrison, Harding, Coolidge, all of them tried to outlaw lynching. They all tried to protect voting rights and increase tolerance, but all received failing or below average grades from the famous historians who disapprove of their economic policies. Textbooks record that Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock to enforce the Supreme Court's 1954 anti-segregation decision in Brown versus Board of Education, but always with the caveat that he did so reluctantly and late. They make less mention of his peaceful desegregation of the nation's capital or his success in passing the first civil rights bill in a century, despite Democratic efforts to weaken it. So complete has been the victory of this view of American history that even Republicans turn away from their past in too many cases. No serious candidates invoke the names of Grant, Harding, Cannon, or Coolidge anymore, though they should. Yet African-American activist Frederick Douglass stood up for Grant in his day. His political descendants did the same for other Republicans. If progressive historians had been less willing to relegate race to secondary importance in explaining the past, or if Republicans had proved less apt pupils, the GOP could cite with telling effect a long train of heroes in our fight against racism. It is for this reason, because it is so true and infects us too much, evidently today, when a smart so-called conservative like Ross Douthat can get this so very, very wrong. And it is for this reason. Some years ago, Harry Jaffa, a Lincoln scholar and Goldwater's most famous speechwriter, could say this: "It would certainly seem that the salvation of the West must come, if it is to come, from the United States. The salvation of the United States, if it is to come, must come from the Republican Party, and the salvation of the Republican Party, if it is to come, must come from the conservative movement within it. And the salvation of the conservative movement, if it is to come, must come from the renewal and reaffirmation of the principles of the American founding, embodied above all in the Declaration of Independence. Such a reaffirmation has happened in the events that led to the election of Abraham Lincoln." I only close with this, Mr. Douthat. Note the side note. Goldwater's most famous speechwriter, a Lincoln scholar, not a Davis or Lee or Stevens scholar. So just when was it again that we had to finally abandon Robert E. Lee and Davis? The real question is, why does the left now embrace them, even if unwittingly? The answer is ineluctable. They hate this place. It reminds me of the Jesse Kelly quote, and I love it. Americans will never be more than 25 feet away from the endless supplies of clean drinking water and still complain about their own country. Meanwhile, some Olympic athlete from some third world dump will wave his flag proudly. Maybe we could take a lesson from them. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.